Welcome to the Business of Apparel podcast. This is the place to learn how to start and scale your own apparel brand and fill it with loyal customers for years to come. I'm your host, Rachel Erickson, owner and CEO of Unmarked Street. I can't wait to share this episode with you. Welcome back to the Business of Apparel podcast. Something happened recently over the last couple of weeks that I love. We've been getting some engagement with the podcast, and what ended up happening is that we got some questions and some comments on what we were putting out into the world. And so it's kind of led to a new episode idea. So a few episodes back, I was talking a little bit about, I think, designing to a cost. I also started to talk about business planning, and I was using a lot of apparel acronyms that a couple of people kind of sent me questions in and were like, I don't really know what you're talking about. Can you maybe put forward some definitions or some sort of like information out there so that those of us who aren't already embedded in the apparel industry have a better understanding of what it is that you're trying to teach? And I thought this was such a brilliant idea. I've actually started putting together a little bit of a Rachel worded apparel dictionary. And what I wanted to do today was go through some of the most important ones, or some of the first ones that I've really started to tackle for this dictionary. I think it'll probably grow and become a little bit more robust as I work on it. But this is definitely something that I wanted to dive into today, get this information out to you. If this is the platform where you're listening to the Business of Apparel and connecting with Unmarked Street and me, I definitely wanted to be able to put it out through this same platform. So for those of you who are watching the podcast on our YouTube channel, I definitely want to say hi and thank you. We really love that you're over there on YouTube. I'm going to be reading a little bit today, which is not how I typically like to record. I don't like to be like reading a script or anything, but I definitely want to make sure I'm going through the list properly. So if my eyes are kind of wandering, that's what's going on there. I'm going to jump into our apparel industry jargon dictionary. For the most part, I want to focus a lot on the abbreviations that we use. If I get through today's episode and there's something that I totally missed, send more comments in. I'd love to definitely follow up. I can either send you more information. And again, once we get this dictionary kind of mapped out and finalized, we will probably make it a free download on the businessofapparel.com. So that's something I'm excited to be able to offer here soon. So thank you to those of you who wrote the comments in and were able to kind of prompt this project because it's a great one. I love it. Okay, so I'm super nerd, so everything here is alphabetized. They are in no other order other than alphabetical. So I'm going to start here with AOP. So if you see something listed in the apparel world as AOP, it typically means all over print. And this is something that we talk about specifically in the cycling world when we're going into sublimation printing. So sublimation printing is something that you take this special ink on this very special paper and you heat press that paper onto your fabric, and it needs to be a polyester fabric to be able to absorb the ink properly. Sublimation, the genuine definition of sublimation is where a solid turns into a gas without kind of that step of being liquid. So the ink on the paper actually turns into a gas, permeates the fabric, and then creates an all-over print for you. Another way that this can be used is that, like when I was doing licensing as a graphic designer, as an intern when I was in school, we also generated all-over prints for like pajama bottoms. For example, we were working with a license with SpongeBob SquarePants. So there'd be like Squidward and SpongeBob in like all of these different configurations. And we would figure out in Adobe Illustrator how to make sure that those prints repeated all over the fabric without seeing any like weird lines or any distortions. So all over print is AOP. You might see that out in the apparel industry. It just means that the fabric has a print all over it, and it's usually a repeat. Next up on our list is BOM. And I will say at the beginning of my career, we were all very careful about using it as an acronym in that way, saying BOM. As I kind of progressed throughout my career and went to different companies, I found that plenty of people are just calling this a bomb. Maybe don't talk about this part of your business if you're on an airplane, but we definitely call these BOMs. What that stands for is Bill of Materials. So your bill of materials is part of your contract or your tech pack with your manufacturer or your supplier. And what it basically lists out is every single item that makes up your product. So it's a list of your materials, and usually it also then lists out the quantity and the price of those materials. So at the end, you can kind of roll it up like a bill. And these are really important to be very detailed, very accurate, so that when your factory receives your BOM, they know exactly every single piece or every single thread or every single packaging item or every single fabric that you want to go into your garment so that they don't miss it. This becomes really important when you go to order all of these items. If you're placing an order with the factory and it's their responsibility to go out to all the suppliers and the mills to arrange for all of that to be shipped on time, your BOM or your bill of materials needs to be really dialed. Next up is CAD. So you've probably heard this used in several different ways, but CAD stands for Computer Aided Design. And if you haven't heard the episode of me talking with Ben Girding, we talk a lot about 3D CAD and how that's kind of a conceptual way of designing and developing apparel these days. So the main definition that I found for this is it's used as a conceptual tool to design and develop products. This is like a digital rendering or a digital sketch of what you want your product to look like, so that when you send it over to your factory, they have a clear understanding of your intention before you actually have a prototype made. Next on our list is CMT. So I think this is one of the ones that came up in the previous episode. So this stands for cut, make, and trim. It is a costing term. This is often also referred to as cut, make, and sew. And it's a quote that you receive from a manufacturer that really only includes their cost to cut and make the garment. So it's a quote of their time, their overhead, their profit to cut the fabric, prepare the garment, and then sew it. It doesn't include your fabric price, any trim prices, any packaging prices, any shipping fees, any duty calculations, any of that. It's very simplified. It's one of the lowest quotes that you can get because it doesn't include all of those other items in it. Next on our list, I'm going to go into cut and sew. So cut and sew is a term that we use when we're using knit fabrics. So this is used a lot in the athletic apparel industry. And it's basically when knit fabrics are laid out and cut like a woven. So for your 2D pattern or your 2D marker, you're going to kind of lay that out and you're going to cut the knit fabric, usually with a laser cutter or with a knife, and they pile it all up and they cut a bunch of layers all at one time. Sometimes you don't do that with a knit, and we'll get there in a second. Usually when you're cutting a knit like that, flat in pieces, that's what we call or refer to as cut and sew. Next on our list is a detail sketch. So if someone is offering to create detail sketches for you, they're taking flats or flat sketches that include stitching, seaming, and construction details of the garment. So when we get there, we'll talk a little bit about flats, but flats are usually very basic. It's just a line drawing. And then the detail sketches that accompany it start to include a bunch of different call outs. And depending on your company, you might have like a construction details library with codes that you can refer to in those sketches. But a lot of the time we end up like calling out different words or calling out different specific stitch codes or reference codes so that the factory knows exactly what to do on that garment and it's very clear. Fabric construction. When someone says fabric construction, they're referring to the specific base of a fabric. So if you went out to a mill and you were trying to research some fabrics that you wanted and you asked them for their fabric construction, they will send back to you a few things. Number one, whether it's a knit, a woven, or a non-woven. And non-woven is a little bit confusing, but that's like leather. Like it's not fibers woven together and it's not kind of yarns put together. It's something completely different. So that's what we mean when we say non-woven. It's kind of a different type of fabric. So it will say whether it's a knit woven or non-woven, the type of structure that it is, so how it's woven together or how it's knitted together, the size of those yarns or threads, and then the weight. And a lot of time we see weight in ounces or grams. And so that's definitely what you would see in a fabric construction. Usually it will be on a sticker on the fabric header. So if you're at a trade show, for example, and they have all of those different fabric swatches hanging, they usually are kind of stapled to a header board or a piece of cardboard, and we call those headers. So that's what you want to look for. You want to look for the fabric construction on those fabric headers. FOB is another costing acronym, and it stands for freight on board. So FOB costing ends up being a cost quote that you get from your supplier or your manufacturer that basically gets your package on board either a ship or an airplane. Freight on board usually includes everything before then. So it's not just cut, make, sew. It's not just what the factory needs to be able to charge you to cut, make, and sew your garment. It also includes all of your fabrics, all of your trims, all of your packaging, all of the boxing, all of the labor that goes into that, and then all of the shipping fees that get it to the port. So it's on board. It's ready to go. That's what an FOB cost quote is. And this is what I always strive to get from my manufacturers and factories. I want them to be bundling all of that for me ahead of time so that I'm not worrying about calculating out how much fabric I bought, how much that entire purchase order was for me, dividing that by the number of units it was able to make, and then trying to kind of guesstimate what my unit cost is. When I get an FOB or freight on board cost quote from my factory, I know exactly what every single unit costs because they do that for me. They give me an FOB quote. I know exactly what my unit costs, which means I now just need to calculate shipping from that airplane or that ship to my warehouse. So that gives me a really good indication of what kind of retail or wholesale price I can sell each unit for to be making a margin that I want. When I work on CMT pricing, that gets a little bit harder. It's a bigger exercise and it's not always as accurate. So if you're working with a manufacturer, definitely asking them to give you FOB or freight on board pricing is something to kind of look at. Next, I'm going to come back to flats. So flats or flat sketches, it's a technical sketch of a product as if it were laying flat on a table or on the floor. And a lot of times we see flat sketches be stylized by some designers. I will say when I was working at Abercrombie, all of our flat sketches were very like skinny and long. So they were kind of in that same method of 9 heads where we draw like fashion croquis and fashion sketches extra tall. Kind of off the topic here. When you draw a fashion sketch, a typical body in real life is about 8 heads tall. And so when you draw a fashion sketch, you actually add a head. And so it makes the image look extra tall and lean. And so we were stylizing a lot of our flat sketches that way. And I will say that it led to some issues because when the factories received those sketches that were stylized instead of being proportionately accurate as if the garment were laying on a table, all of a sudden we were getting like really long sleeves, like they were like falling off of the model's hands when we received them. The body lengths were really long. Everything was kind of a little bit too tiny. And so I can definitely recommend that if you're doing flats or if someone is doing flat sketches for you, the more accurate that they can be based on a real life body is going to result in better prototypes for you. So on a flat sketch, it's usually just a black and white drawing, a line sketch that someone will put together, put all of the details of that garment on it for you. These flat sketches can then be used to create like colorway sketches. You can color them in and kind of decide what colors you want to then do for your line. Full fashioned. So full fashioned is kind of the opposite of cut and sew. These are knit garments that have been shaped on a flat knitting machine. So a flat knitting machine kind of looks like an electric keyboard, and it's got all of these little needles in it, and you thread the whole thing up with your yarns, and you kind of like run this guide back and forth over the needles, and it starts to knit the garment for you. I did some of this in college. I loved using a flat knitting machine. It's kind of always been on my like little bucket list to buy one and to have one in my house because it was so much fun always using that flat knitting machine, creating garments. But that is like forming and shaping the garment on that machine as opposed to being cut and sewn like a woven would. So that is full fashion knits. Full fashion knits are usually sweaters. Like when you receive a sweater, that's usually full fashioned. Grading. A great definition of grading is proportionately increasing or decreasing the dimensions of parts of a product according to the size ranges intended for production. So a grade rule in grading is basically giving all of the measurements and that increase or decrease amount on a worksheet to your factory so that they know how much bigger or how much smaller a garment needs to be in your size range. So usually we start with a size medium in the apparel industry because that's kind of the middle of most ranges. That's why it's called a medium. And once we go from there, we then want to say, okay, the small is 2 inches smaller at the chest, 2 inches smaller at the waist, a half inch smaller in length, and whatever else is part of your grade rule for your manufacturer. So those are the rules. And then, for example, if your medium is 40 inches in the chest, your actual measurement of grading for the small would be 38. And so those rules are then applied to create the actual garment measurements. And your factory will then use your grade to manipulate the pattern to create what we call a graded nest. So your graded nest is a flat 2D pattern where instead of just showing one shape or one size, it shows a bunch of them stacked on top of each other so you can see where the factory has chosen to make those sizing changes. And if you've ever done any home sewing and you've purchased like a Simplicity pattern or a Vogue pattern at Joann Fabrics or something like that, you'll see those are all graded nests as well. So you see all the sizes on there and they're all kind of stacked on top of each other based on whatever size you need to cut out for yourself. To define a knit is basically a fabric created by interlocking loops of yarn. Knits are usually stretchier than wovens are, and they're usually used in more athletic wear. LDP is our next acronym to go through, and this stands for Landed Duty Paid. So LDP is the third costing acronym that we have in here. Let's say, for example, you got your manufacturer to give you a freight on board or FOB quote. Once you've paid not just for that FOB price, but you've also paid for it to get shipped to your own warehouse, and it's now sitting at your warehouse fully paid for, all of the duties are paid, all of the customs fees are paid, all of your shipping costs are paid. That's the final price that you include to roll up all of your margins. So that is the total price, and that is your LDP. So it's landed in your warehouse. And so when I think LDP, I always think landed price. A marker is a full-scale diagram, usually on paper or digitally rendered. A lot of factories do markers digitally now, indicating the most fabric-conscious placement for all the graded pattern pieces in a garment. So this is used in fabric cutting processes for production. A marker will have like all of the pieces of the garment from extra small to double extra large or whatever your size range is, placed on the entire width and length of the fabric that you're providing to them so that it's not creating a lot of fabric waste. So what these computer programs typically do is figure out how to nestle all of the pieces as close as possible to each other. So when it goes through the cutting machines or it goes under the knife to be cut, you only have these like teeny little scraps of fabric. That is definitely a cost savings for you and the factory. And it's also a better sustainability practice to have low waste when you're cutting your fabrics like that. Ben Girding, again, who was on our episode quite a while ago, was talking a little bit about his ideas with Kelpie design. And I don't think one thing we got into, but an idea that he had on his line was to figure out how to be zero waste in his pattern markers. And I thought that was such a brilliant idea, like figuring out how to really nest pattern pieces together so that like once you cut one piece, it is the side of the next piece and there is zero waste in that marker. That would be such a cool project, I think, to go into. Our next acronym is MOQ. So minimum order quantity is MOQ. I will also put in here MCQ, which is minimum color quantity. So these are the minimums quantities that a vendor requires you to order in order to contract their goods and services. This is usually the first thing that I tell my clients to ask new manufacturers when they're interviewing them or trying to get to work with them. A lot of factories will require you to order up to 3,000 units of a garment to be able to work with them. And if you can't afford 3,000 of a certain garment right up front, you're not going to be able to work with them. So you need to go back to the drawing board and find a new factory or find a new manufacturer. This is a great way of understanding who you can and can't work with when you get started. And then as you grow and as you're able to order more units, you can then start to work with some of those bigger factories who have the bigger MOQs. Now, most factories have an MOQ. They want you to order a certain amount, but they'll also be telling you about the MCQ, which is usually a minimum color quantity that you have to order in your fabrication. So when we order fabric, there's also an MOQ. So a mill will say, for example, you need to order 1,000 yards of something, because usually if you order less than an MOQ, the quality of the fabric is poor. And that's because it needs to go through the machine, whether it's being woven or whether it's being knit, it needs to go through the machine on such a large scale to create quality and consistency. So when you're trying to buy less than an MOQ of a certain fabric, you're actually really risking the quality of that fabric and then the quality of your garments. That's when we see a lot of like torquing. Like if you've ever purchased a t-shirt where the side seams kind of like move on you and you can't figure out how to get them to lay on your body properly, that's what's called torquing. And that's usually a fabric quality issue. So that manufacturer that you purchased from for that t-shirt might have not been able to afford an MOQ of fabric. So they purchased under, the fabric quality was poor, which resulted in a poor fitting t-shirt. So it really is a trickle down problem. You want to try to hit MOQs as much as you can. MCQ is also usually at the mill level, where they'll then say, okay, you hit your 1,000 order quantity, but you want to order this in 3 different colors. Well, our MCQ is 500. So really you can only do 2 colors, because you can do 500 yards of one color, 500 yards of a second color to hit your 1,000 yard MOQ. You don't really want to buy more than 1,000 yards. So that will indicate to you how many colorways of a garment you can have. And so understanding, again, all of that up front is going to really help you do line planning and help you with your sourcing. A pattern is a paper or a digital model of each piece of a product. So again, kind of going back, if you're a home sewer and you've gone to Joann Fabrics and you go pick up like a simplicity pattern, all of each individual piece, once you put them together, makes up your entire pattern. We have pattern engineers on a lot of our corporate side of the business who work with pattern files digitally, manipulating them in the computer. These are used as a guide to cut and construct a product. So sometimes there will be instructions, notches, gathering information on a pattern. A lot of that's really important for the factory to be able to see how to put that product together. PO is next. So if you're hearing the words PO, that stands for purchase order. And a purchase order is a legal binding contract between the buyer and a supplier to purchase a certain number of goods at a specific mutually agreed to price. So your purchase order, when you place that formally, is an agreement from you legally that says, I will buy this from you. I have the money on hand, or I will have the money on hand when it is due. And this is exactly how much I want to buy from you. And this is exactly how much I am going to pay. Cost negotiations need to happen before you put in an official purchase order so that when you place it, it is firm and it is final. Going back and forth negotiating a purchase order is not usually desirable. At that point, you usually want to be pretty buttoned up on all of the details that go into that PO. And then that's when the factory gets triggered to go on bulk production. They start making it for you, and within the allotted time, usually you have a due date on that PO as well. They'll then ship it to you. A proto or a prototype is a full-size working model of a new product or a new version of an existing product. And we use prototypes usually for fittings, garment evaluations. So when you receive a first proto, for example, you want to put it on a fit model. You want to make sure that it feels, looks, is constructed all the ways that you wanted it to. And when that's happening, you also want to get your design team involved. We definitely have a lot of different information that can go into a fitting, but that's what protos are typically used for. We want to test out, does the pattern work? Does the shaping work? Is it as tight as I want it to be? Is it as loose as I want it to be? Do the pockets look right? Are they in the right position? by prototyping all of these out, you're able to evaluate that in real time on a real body and look to see if you need to make any changes. And then you can move through the prototyping process to get a second or third proto until you get to a full size run, which is basically seeing how the graded specs or how the graded specifications or measurements that you've already put forward worked out for all of the sizes. Do they fit on an extra small, a small, medium, etc. body the way that you want them to? And without prototyping, we're never able to really see what that garment in production is going to look and feel like. And without prototyping, we have very little control over what the garments turn out to be for our customers. So prototyping is super important in the apparel industry. Sourcing is a process of obtaining goods or services from a manufacturer, either domestically or globally. So sourcing is basically an entire department at corporate apparel brands. There's like a sourcing director, and then there's a bunch of different people working on sourcing for the different departments. And they're going out and creating relationships with, introducing themselves to, and then maintaining relationships with all of our different manufacturing partners, our mills, our trim suppliers, our packaging suppliers. A lot of times they'll even work hand in hand with operations and logistics teams to make sure that we're maintaining those relationships with our freight forwarders who handle all of our shipping. The sourcing team is really important in the apparel industry by keeping everybody on the same page, keeping everybody happy, and also kind of tracking basically the quality or the performance of everybody involved. So a lot of sourcing departments will be in charge of vendor metrics, like did they ship on time? How was the quality? Did they have any units that they couldn't ship because quality was bad? All of that at like some of the best companies is tracked really well by sourcing teams. A tech pack, or in long words, a technical specification package, includes all the information to communicate to a vendor how to produce a product. So this includes size, measurements, fabrication, trims, quality standards, everything that you need them to follow to make the garment to the standards that you expect needs to go into your tech pack. This is basically the contract of what your product needs to be in order to be accepted once they ship it to you. So this can be considered a legally binding document. Your tech pack, as buttoned up as it possibly can be, is going to be a really strong piece of paperwork for you to have for your brand. Next, WIP. WIP is a work in progress. This is used in many different industries, but it's basically like a document that we use to track the development flow. So when did we send our tech pack? When are we expecting to see the first proto? When did we send first proto comments? When did we have our first proto fitting? A lot of our WIP reports just kind of have all of this in mind with due dates so that we can kind of track and see if we're behind or ahead schedule or how we're doing there. And last but not least on my list is woven. So in comparison to a knit, a woven is a fabric composed of two yarns running in perpendicular directions, and we call those warps and wefts. And those are woven together on a machine. So that's a little bit of an easy or upfront list of apparel jargon words that you might be hearing a lot from me. And if you're exploring options to get into the apparel industry, or if you're a small startup brand and you're hearing some of these and you're not quite sure what they are, first of all, if anybody says anything that you're not sure what it is, just ask. A lot of us in the apparel industry understand that we use acronyms and we use like 3-letter phrases like words, and we tend to forget that people don't always understand what they are. Just ask us. We will be happy to explain exactly what we mean. Probably if they're anything like me, with way too many words and way too much explanation. But yeah, definitely just ask. And then also keep an eye out for this to go up on the Business of Apparel website. We'll be offering this as a free download here soon. And if you have any other questions, and again, if I missed anything that you wanted to know about, please let me know. I'd be more than happy to go back through and add anything to it that I can.
Thank you so much for listening to the Business of Apparel podcast. I would so appreciate hearing your thoughts on the show. And if you know someone who could benefit from it, please share it with them. My biggest desire is to help other apparel professionals understand the nuances of our industry so we can all work toward making better product for a better world. If you would like to connect further, I'd love to invite you to send me a message through my website, unmarkstreet.com, where I do weekly trainings through my video channel, a monthly newsletter, and offer so many resources to help you start and scale a profitable apparel brand.